Vanessa Carter sat in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edge of the wooden bench. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest as she watched the judge prepare to deliver a verdict that could change her brother's life forever. Malcolm had been falsely accused, and despite the evidence in his favor, the prosecution had pushed hard to paint him as guilty. Vanessa had spent months fighting for him, attending every hearing, rallying supporters, and making sure the truth was heard. But now, as the judge's gavel rested on the bench, her heart pounded with uncertainty. The room was silent, except for the occasional rustle of papers and the tapping of shoes against the polished floor. Vanessa took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Just as the judge cleared his throat, preparing to speak, she felt a presence beside her. A uniformed officer had stepped up, towering over her with a firm stance. "Ma'am, you need to leave," the officer said, his voice low but firm. Vanessa frowned, turning her head sharply to look at him. "Excuse me?" "You need to exit the courtroom," he repeated, his grip tightening around her upper arm. She yanked her arm away, a spark of anger rising in her chest. "I have every right to be here. This is a public hearing." Several heads turned in their direction. Murmurs rippled through the audience, and Vanessa felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching the confrontation unfold. The officer's expression remained cold and impassive. "No disruptions are allowed," he said. "I haven't disrupted anything," Vanessa shot back. "I'm sitting here, quietly waiting for the verdict like everyone else." The officer's grip tightened again, more forceful this time. "I won't ask again." Vanessa's pulse raced. She could feel the tension rising in the room. Even Malcolm, sitting at the defendant's table, turned his head, his expression filled with concern. The judge finally took notice of the commotion and struck his gavel against the bench. "Officer, what is the issue here?" the judge asked, his voice edged with irritation. The officer hesitated, shifting on his feet. He hadn't expected to be questioned so soon. She was causing a disturbance," he said, though the uncertainty in his tone was evident. Vanessa shook her head in disbelief. "That's a lie. I've been sitting here silently." The judge studied her for a long moment. Just then, the door to his chambers opened, and an aide hurried in, leaning close to whisper something into his ear. His face shifted instantly, his brows rising in surprise. A strange silence fell over the room as the judge straightened in his seat. His gaze flickered toward Vanessa, then to the officer still gripping her arm. His voice came out strong and decisive. "Let her go." The officer's expression faltered, confusion flashing in his eyes. "Your Honor, I was just—" "Let her go," the judge repeated. The officer hesitated, then released Vanessa's arm. She stepped back, shaking off the lingering pressure from his grip. She looked at the judge, her mind racing. "There has been a development," the judge announced. "Miss Carter, please remain seated." A ripple of curiosity and confusion spread through the room. Vanessa's heart pounded. Something was happening, something big, and she had no idea what was coming next. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Vanessa could feel the weight of an unspoken tension settling over everyone as the judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The officer who had tried to remove her stood rigid, his face tight with confusion, as if trying to process what had just happened. Vanessa, still shaken from the officer's aggressive grip, eased back into her seat, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Malcolm, seated at the defendant's table, exchanged a look with her, one filled with silent questions. What was going on? What had changed? The judge turned to the bailiff and whispered something under his breath. The bailiff nodded quickly and exited the courtroom, leaving behind a thick silence. Every eye was on the judge now, waiting. The prosecution looked impatient, shifting in their seats, and Malcolm's lawyer leaned forward, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Vanessa's mind raced through the possibilities. Had some last-minute evidence surfaced? Had a witness come forward? Was there an error in the proceedings that could overturn the entire case? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she knew one thing for sure. Someone, somewhere, had intervened. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "This court has received a call from a high-ranking official. Due to the nature of the request, we will be taking a brief recess before proceeding further." Gasps rippled through the room. A high-ranking official? What did that even mean? And why had that call come at this exact moment? The prosecutor immediately stood, a look of frustration crossing his face. Your Honor, with all due respect, we were moments away from reaching a verdict. A recess at this stage seems highly unusual. The judge gave him a firm look. I understand your concern, but I assure you, this is not a decision made lightly. Vanessa sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribcage. She had fought so hard to get Malcolm's case the attention it deserved, reaching out to journalists, activists, and even legal advocacy groups. But never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that someone with real power, someone who could pick up the phone and call a judge in the middle of a trial, would step in. The officer who had tried to remove her shifted awkwardly, as if realizing he had made a mistake. But Vanessa had no time to dwell on that now. Her focus was entirely on what was about to happen next. The bailiff returned, whispered something to the judge, and then stepped back. The judge nodded solemnly and looked toward Malcolm. Mr. Carter, remain seated. We will reconvene shortly. The courtroom doors swung open and a hush fell over the crowd. Vanessa turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. They scanned the room briefly before locking eyes with the judge. Something told Vanessa that this was no ordinary intervention. Something told her that whatever was happening was bigger than she could have ever imagined. The two men in suits moved with quiet authority, their presence shifting the energy in the courtroom. Whispers spread like wildfire through the spectators, everyone exchanging nervous glances as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Even the judge, a man who had likely seen his fair share of unusual situations, looked somewhat uneasy. Vanessa felt her pulse quicken. She clutched the armrest of her chair, trying to steady herself as the reality of the moment sank in. Whoever these men were, they weren't ordinary government officials. Their suits were pressed to perfection, their movements precise, controlled. They weren't just here to observe, they were here for a reason. The taller of the two men approached the judge's bench and leaned in, speaking in hushed tones. Whatever he said made the judge stiffen slightly before nodding in understanding. He glanced toward Malcolm, his expression unreadable. Vanessa's stomach twisted. Was this good news or bad news? The judge cleared his throat and looked out at the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, this case is now under federal review. The court will be adjourned until further notice. The reaction was instant. Gasps, murmurs, confusion. The prosecutor leaped to his feet. Your Honor, this case has already been reviewed by the state. We are in the final stages of trial. With all due respect, a delay at this point. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. This decision is no longer in my hands. Malcolm's lawyer turned to him, whispering urgently. Vanessa wished she could hear what was being said, but her focus was pulled toward Malcolm himself. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, his face unreadable. But Vanessa knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding his breath. The officer who had tried to remove Vanessa earlier now looked downright nervous, as if realizing he had tangled with someone connected to something far bigger than he had anticipated. He stepped back, avoiding her gaze. Vanessa's mind raced. Had one of the organizations she had contacted actually gotten through to someone high up? Or had someone in the White House seen the growing media coverage and decided to intervene? The possibilities swirled in her mind, but she had no concrete answers. The shorter of the two men in suits turned toward Malcolm and gestured for him to stand. Mr. Carter, you'll be coming with us. Malcolm hesitated for only a moment before rising to his feet. His lawyer immediately interjected. Where are you taking my client? The man's expression remained neutral. You'll receive full details soon. But for now, we need to move quickly. Vanessa's heart pounded. This wasn't how she had expected today to go. She had prepared herself for a verdict, one that she had feared would not be in Malcolm's favor. But now, everything had changed. As Malcolm was escorted out of the courtroom, he locked eyes with Vanessa. There was uncertainty there, but also something else, hope. Whatever was happening, it was big, and Vanessa wasn't about to back down now. Vanessa stood frozen as Malcolm was led out of the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. Just moments ago, the judge had been in full control, the prosecution had been pushing their case, and Malcolm had been facing what felt like an inevitable fate. Now, With the arrival of these mysterious government agents and the sudden adjournment, everything had changed. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder as people speculated about what had just happened. Reporters rushed out to make calls, and the prosecution looked furious, scrambling to understand how their case had just been derailed. The officer who had tried to remove Vanessa earlier was now standing stiffly in the corner, his hands clenched at his sides. He had clearly realized he had made a mistake. Vanessa shook herself out of her daze and rushed toward Malcolm's lawyer, Mr. DeWitt. "Where are they taking him?" she asked urgently. DeWitt looked just as stunned as she felt, flipping through his notes as if the answer might somehow be there. "I don't know," he admitted. "This was completely unexpected. Federal intervention at this stage is almost unheard of. Someone high up must have pulled some strings." Vanessa's mind raced. Who could have possibly done this? The only people she had reached out to were civil rights organizations, a few activists, and some journalists. None of them had the power to make the government step in so suddenly. Unless... She pulled out her phone and checked her emails. Nothing new. No messages that explained what had just happened. Then she scrolled through her call log, her stomach tightening when she saw a number she didn't recognize. Had someone from the White House actually reached out and she had missed it? Determined to find out more, Vanessa turned on her heels and followed the agents out of the courthouse. She wasn't about to let Malcolm disappear without a fight. As she reached the exit, she spotted them leading him toward a black SUV with tinted windows. "Malcolm!" she called out, her voice breaking through the chatter of the press and bystanders. One of the agents turned, giving her a sharp look, but Malcolm twisted slightly and met her eyes. There was no fear in them, only quiet determination. "Where are you taking him?" she demanded, stepping forward. The taller agent sighed, as if he had expected this. "Miss, this is a federal matter now. We can't discuss details here." Vanessa squared her shoulders. "Then tell me where I can find out." The agent hesitated before finally responding. "The Department of Justice will be making a statement soon." Then, without another word, he opened the SUV door and guided Malcolm inside. Vanessa stood there, helpless, as the car pulled away. She clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. She had spent so long fighting for Malcolm, refusing to let the system chew him up and spit him out like so many others. Now, when it finally seemed like something was shifting, she had no idea who was pulling the strings or what their endgame was. DeWitt came up beside her. "Whatever just happened, it means someone with power is watching," he murmured. "That's a good thing." Vanessa wasn't sure if it was. Hours later, she sat in her small apartment, glued to the news. Every channel was covering the trial's sudden halt, and speculation was running wild. Some pundits were claiming corruption, others were saying this was proof of government overreach. But no one seemed to know exactly why Malcolm had been taken into federal custody or what it meant for his case. Then, finally, a breaking news banner flashed across the screen. "The White House has released a statement regarding the sudden intervention in the case of Malcolm Carter," the anchor announced. According to sources, the president himself was made aware of the case early this morning and has expressed deep concern over potential legal irregularities. The Department of Justice is now reviewing the trial proceedings, citing potential constitutional violations. Vanessa's breath caught. The president. Somehow, in some way, Malcolm's case had reached the highest office in the country. Her phone buzzed, and she snatched it up, her hands trembling. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for only a second before answering. "Hello," a smooth voice responded. "Miss Wright, this is Special Counsel David Foster. I believe you have some questions about today's events." Vanessa gripped the phone tighter. "You could say that." There was a brief pause before he continued. "You should know that Malcolm Carter's case is now under federal review. There were discrepancies in the way his trial was conducted, and concerns have been raised about the validity of the charges." She let out a shaky breath. "So what does that mean? Will he be freed?" Foster hesitated. "That depends on what we find. But I can tell you this. Malcolm Carter is no longer just another case lost in the system. People are watching now." Vanessa's mind spun. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Someone, whether it was an activist, a journalist, or even a politician, had gotten the attention of the most powerful office in the country. And now, The fight wasn't just about Malcolm anymore. It was about the system that had tried to silence him. As she hung up the phone, she realized one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.